White is a color infamous for having high highs and low lows. Despite having some of the most impactful creatures in removal, the color has also been saddled with some of the worst life gain cards and terrible beaters throughout the game's history. Today, we're going to go over the absolute bottom of the barrel when it comes to white cards. Starting us off at number 10, we have Aven Trooper. This is a 1/1 bird soldier with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and it has the ability where you can pay 2 and 1 white and discard a card to give it +1/+2 until the end of turn. Paying 4 mana for a 1/1 would only be worth it if the creature had a crazy ability to make it worth it, and Trooper has no good abilities whatsoever. Flying is an okay upside, but it's not nearly enough to make up for Trooper's horrible rate. For a good benchmark, it's worth comparing to cards like Rustwing Falcon, a 1/2 for 1 white with flying. While creatures have come a long way since the earliest days of Magic, this rate wouldn't have been broken even at the time. The ability to pay 3 mana and discard an entire card for a paltry stat boost is more of a slap in the face than an actual upside. The pump will almost never matter, and you'll often still lose to creatures around the same mana cost or even cheaper ones. Even in the early days of Magic, cards like Air Elemental would beat Trooper in combat even if you activated it once. Even against cards it could beat in combat with an activation, like Wind Drake, you're still losing a huge amount of tempo by paying so much mana, and still trading even in cards as you have to discard a card. Trying to use it to push through extra damage is probably worse than just casting whatever cards are in your hand as well. Even pitching lands to the ability is a waste, as they'd probably be more useful just making more mana for you later. It's also worth mentioning Takano's Cavalry, another 1/1 for 4 mana that's equally terrible. Though Trooper is probably a little worse because Takano's Bushido allows it to beat some 1-drops in combat without any more help. Still, both of these cards are some of the worst creatures Wizards has ever printed, and it's legitimately hard to imagine a use case for these cards over any other creature in the game, outside of a few even worse threats higher up on this list. And at number 9, we have Alabaster Leech. This is a 1/3 leech with a mana cost of 1 white. It is the ability where all white spells you cast cost 1 more to cast. This is a member of a cycle for 5 leeches, 1 for each color that each made all the other colors of spells cost more to cast. In exchange for this massive downside, the leeches were rather imposing for the cost, trading upfront efficiency for a weaker rest of the game. None of the leeches sans Jade Leech were really worth playing, however, for a few reasons. For one, they were still quite understated by modern day standards, as creatures were very overestimated in terms of power early on in the game. This means that they were often just not good enough clocks considering how much worse they made the rest of your cards. Alabaster is by far the absolute worst of the cycle, being an active detriment in most games. A 1/3 for 1 is above rate, but that doesn't exactly make it good. It's far too weak to be threatening, meaning your opponent can just ignore it for several turns until they have a better threat in play that completely outclasses it. The only thing that Leech is theoretically good for is blocking early game threats like Savannah Lions. However, this only lets it match up well into some 1-mana creatures. Most 2-mana creatures, such as Grizzly Bears, can actually attack through it without fear of dying, and a 2/2 for 2 is considered a modest stat line. As soon as the second turn of the game happens, Leech is already outclassed by most creatures, and its ability will actively be hurting you most of the time. On turn 2, you'll only be able to play another 1-drop, meaning you'll be even further behind on subsequent turns. The only possible use for the card would be donating it to your opponent to try to mess with their plays, but that won't work either because it only makes white cards cost more. If your opponent isn't playing white, they'll be able to cast all their other cards without the tax coming up. So the card does nothing in basically any deck or situation. You're far better off just playing other beaters instead of dealing with Leech's tax. And at number 8, we have Bargain. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and 1 white. It is the effect where target opponent draws a card and you gain 7 life. It shouldn't be too hard to explain why a card that helps your opponent is bad. While 7 life for 3 mana is a fine rate, it's not such a good effect that giving your opponent a whole card is a good trade. Even normal life gain cards like Angel's Mercy, you'll cast them, and then your opponent will spend their turn developing a threat. Since you'll use an entire turn and a card gaining life, you'll start losing on board, and your opponent can just attack an extra time or two to outpace all the life you gain. Basically, gaining life by itself doesn't actually win a game of Magic. So using too much mana or cards gaining life instead of doing anything else will eventually lose you the game. Bargain is even worse, as it actually puts you down 2 cards instead of just 1. Against the vast majority of decks, casting a Bargain will actively lower your chances of winning the game. Still, there is a matchup where it could at least conceivably be useful. Burn decks simply try to win the game by casting a ton of spells like Lava Spike, which deals direct damage to your opponent. Bargain basically undoes 2 of those burn spells, so letting your opponent draw 1 card that will deal less damage than you heal for is not as bad. Still, there's no reason to use this over any other life gain spell, as giving your opponent another burn spell will make it easier for them to dig out the life you gave them. Considering that it's not even good in the one possible matchup where it could be worth casting, Bargain easily finds itself on this list. And at number 7, we have Visions. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 white. It is the effect where you look at the top 5 cards of target player's library, and then you may shuffle that library. Some people may be asking why this card is so bad. After all, Index is a similar card that's at least okay, even if it's not amazing or anything. The thing is, Visions lacks a very important line of text. It doesn't say anything about putting them back in any order. So you get to look at the top 5 cards, and then you can choose if you want to replace them with totally random cards. And that's all the control you get. This is actually pretty bad, as it doesn't give you enough control over the draws to actually be worth casting. With cards like Index, the main strategy is to put the good cards to the top and then maybe try to mill the bad cards or shuffle them away with some other effect. This isn't really possible with Visions, as if you have multiple bad cards on top, you would have to shuffle them all away, which didn't really help fix your draws very much. This comparison is made even worse by the fact that shuffling your deck is a lot easier to do than reordering cards in your deck, making Index much easier to take advantage of. Famously, cards like the fetch lands will shuffle your library as part of their effect, but other cards like tutors can have the same effect. This means that with clever deck building, you can quite easily reorder the cards you see off of an effect like Index and then only have to draw good cards. With Visions, however, the information you get off of looking at the top 5 cards is very difficult to make use of. You'll usually have to either just accept the next 5 draws it shows you or abandon them entirely. A level of top deck manipulation that's not impactful enough for an entire card. If Visions drew even 1 card or was simply a white version of Index, it wouldn't have made onto this list, but as it works right now, it's usually just a waste of a card. And at number 6, we have Ignoble Soldier. This is a 3/1 human soldier with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has abilities where, whenever it's blocked, you prevent all damage that it would deal that turn. Not all damage that would be dealt to it, all damage it would deal. So your opponent can block this card with any creature as long as they want, and they'll never lose anything to it. And if their blocker has any power at all, Ignoble will die in combat. This is all you really need to know about the card to know how bad it is. While its stat line is technically better than Aven Trooper's, it can't actually use that stat line. The only way this card could possibly be used is if your opponent has exactly 0 creatures on the battlefield. In any other board state, it's just a waste of cardboard. This also isn't a situation where a modern lens just makes the card look worse than it originally was. This was always a terrible deal. Any other 3-mana creature around the time would have done better. While there weren't many 3-power creatures for 3 mana around the time, you did have a lot of 3-mana 2/2s with upsides. There aren't even any clever ways to take advantage of the card's ability. Honestly, just about any creature would be more worth playing than Soldier. Soldier isn't just one of the worst white creatures, it's probably one of the worst creatures of all time in general. And at number 5, we have Security Detail. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white. It is an ability where you can pay 2 white to create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, but you can only activate this card once each turn and only if you control no creatures. Detail is a famously overcosted card with a restriction that feels entirely unnecessary. While the ability to create tokens is on the same rate as other similar cards like Ant Queen, paying so much mana to get the cards out makes it a lot less attractive. Paying 6 mana for the first 1/1 is simply too much for a card to ever be viable. However, only being able to activate it if your board is completely clear makes the card almost completely useless. Most of the time, you simply won't be able to activate the ability at all, as you'll either have another creature in play or have already used the ability to make another token. To be able to make tokens with the card consistently, you need to not play any other creatures in your deck. If you do, all you'll get is a small creature with no abilities that your opponent can easily just ignore. The only real use for the token would be to chump block with it. But in that role, it just doesn't do enough. Cards like Wall of Blossoms can block a creature every turn way earlier than Security Detail can, and it draws you a card when it enters the battlefield to draw more action. Not only does this let it prevent more damage earlier in the game, but it does so for a fraction of the mana. If you're trying to use Detail to block damage, you'll have to pay 2 mana every turn for a new blocker, which will quickly add up. Honestly, just about any wall would do a better job than Detail would at keeping you alive, not just the good ones like Wall of Blossoms. Security Detail is technically one of the more potentially useful cards on this list. theoretically giving you an endless supply of creatures, but its restrictions and mana cost make it simply unplayable. And at number 4, we have Fortified Area. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 2 white. It is an ability where all wall creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain banding. Banding is a very old and largely useless mechanic that has the following paragraph for its rules text. Any number of creatures with banding and up to one without can attack in a band. Bands are blocked as a group, but if any number of creatures with banding you control block or are blocked, you get to divide that creature's damage amongst your creatures rather than its controller. If you didn't understand what that meant, don't worry, no one else really gets it either. Luckily, a failure to understand banding has never mattered in a game of Magic because the ability is absolutely terrible. Banding actually makes blocking easier for the opponent, and reorganizing damage just doesn't matter enough at the time. Fortified Area is made even worse by only working with walls, one of the weakest creature types in the game thanks to every creature with the type having Defender, preventing them from ever attacking. This means that the rather meager +1/+0 Fortified Area gives out will be even less useful. Playing a ton of creatures that can't actually end the game and hoping that your opponent attacks into them with low toughness creatures so that you can block them and kill them, despite the fact they could see your creatures on the field and know it's a bad idea to attack, surprisingly, wasn't that good of a strategy. Generally, what would normally happen is your opponent would just sit back and wait until they found a way to actually get damage through or drew removal and then attack, which they could easily do thanks to your walls not actually threatening your opponent in any way. While there are some semi-viable wall-based strategies, they all require some level of synergy between your various defenders. Fortified Area doesn't help make any of these synergies more powerful, and doesn't make them any better outside of the synergies either. There are even cards that do a better job of making your walls more threatening. Cards like Assault Formation allow them to use their toughness to assign damage and allow them to attack despite having Defender. Not only do these let your walls do way more damage, it lets them be an actual threat. Despite how much better Formation is, it never saw any competitive play. It was just too slow and clunky to really work. And if Formation was still bad, you can guess how useless Fortified Area is. And at number 3, we have Aven Shrine. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 2 white. It is an ability where, whenever a player casts a spell, they gain X life, where X is the number of cards in all graveyards with the same name as that spell. Aven Shrine is a combination of multiple issues we've seen with cards on this list so far. It costs too much mana for an effect that doesn't affect the board, doesn't work consistently enough, and it also helps your opponent. It's worth noting first that the card will very rarely gain you life, and when it does, it will give you a paltry amount. Dragonlord Kolaghan has a somewhat similar ability where, whenever an opponent casts a creature or planeswalker spell with the same name as one in the graveyard, they lose 10 life. Despite how powerful this ability could be, it very rarely comes up in games with Kolaghan. It just isn't all that common for players to have the same copies of cards in their graveyard and in their hand, especially in the late game. Unless you're trying to put cards into your graveyard, it's fairly easy to not find several copies of the same card in a game. Aven Shrine has an even less relevant ability, and one that requires multiple copies of a card in your graveyard to really start to get value. The best use for this card would be combined with cards like Persistent Petitioners, which have the ability that allows you to play as many of them in your deck as you'd like. That way, you could easily gain 3 or 4 life off of each cast, gaining a sizable chunk of life rather than the breadcrumbs it normally gives you. The issue is, this is still pretty terrible, as the life you gain off a shrine isn't enough to stop you from dying in any of the formats where this could be done. You'd be better off trying to resolve a Thrumming Stone extremely quickly and grabbing a ton of Petitioners from your deck all at once. So even with the few cards that the card could possibly work with, it's simply too bad at its job to be worth casting. And at number 2, we have Glyph of Life. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 white. It is the effect where you choose target wall creature. Whenever damage is dealt to that wall by an attacking creature this turn, you gain that much life. Yet another symptom of a time when Wizards was obsessed with walls and creatures that couldn't attack. Glyph of Life is a combination of 2 niche effects. It only works with walls and only gains you life. Gaining life is a bad effect, which we've already harped on quite a bit in this video. What makes Glyph of Life special is that it only works if you're playing walls, and only once, which is so narrow and bad that it legitimately makes you wonder why it works this way. Combat tricks very rarely see play in competitive Magic, usually only seen play when they happen to be particularly good in aggro decks. Cards like Temur Battle Rage have seen play in very particular decks when it could be used to push for lethal damage on a single turn. Glyph of Life does the exact opposite, gaining you a usually insubstantial amount of life and not doing anything proactive at all. It doesn't even help you in combat or save your creatures from removal. This is actually from a cycle of 5 glyphs that all only work with walls, and they were all pretty terrible. Glyph of Life might be the worst of them all though, as it's the only effect that actively does nothing at all. Somehow though, there's still a card worse than that. And at number 1, we have Fasting. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 white. It is abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a hunger counter on it. Then you destroy it if there are 5 or more hunger counters on the card. Whenever you would begin your draw step, you can skip the draw step to gain 2 life instead. Finally, whenever you draw a card, you destroy Fasting. This is one of the most immediately awful effects in all of Magic. Bargain was bad because it traded cards for life at a rate that wasn't really worth it. And Fasting takes this to the moon and back with how bad the rate is. If you skip your next 4 draw steps, you gain an amazing 8 life. 1 life more than Bargain gives you. Even worse, the card will blow itself up if you ever draw a card. So if you choose to stop skipping draw steps or play any card that draws you more cards, you'll lose out on the option to gain any more life in the future. You also can't combine this with cards like Words of Worship, which will replace your drawing of a card with a different beneficial effect. Fasting skips your entire draw step, so you'll never be instructed by the game to draw a card and won't trigger the words. So unfortunately, Fasting won't be very good in your skip my own draw step tribal deck. It's almost impossible to come up with a use case for Fasting. It isn't even good against Burn, as it gains you 2 little life, and skipping so many draws will mean you can't really fight back against the deck. Playing Fasting will always lower your chances of winning. It just doesn't do enough and asks for way too high of a cost. With all that in mind, it's pretty easy to call Fasting the worst white card in the game. Alright, and that's the list. There are some notable cards that didn't make this list, like Great Wall and Ice and Highway, but they've appeared in a few lists like this already. So I decided to talk about other cards instead. Anyway, are there any cards you think we've missed? If so, we'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below.